We're joined now by Martin Lemberg Pedersen from the Centre of Advanced Migration Studies at the University of Copenhagen. Thanks for joining us on France 24 today, sir. What, in your view, is the government's justification for this policy?
Well, the government is offering what it calls itself a humanitarian justification. They are focusing on the terrible conditions for migrants crossing the Mediterranean, and they're saying that their model is going to put an end to that. However, if you look at other recent experiences with a country like Rwanda, there's a lot to question this interpretation, because Israel and Rwanda had an agreement between 2013 and 17 where 4,000 people were sent from Israel to Rwanda. And out of these, most actually ended up remigrating and going back into human smuggling networks and ended up in European countries. So there's a lot to say that this kind of exterritorialization is in effect going to add another level of the human smuggling dynamics that the government is using as its argument for the policy.
Yeah, and you mentioned Rwanda as one of those possible destinations. Egypt and Eritrea listed as potential other ones. These are not countries with glowing human rights records. Do you think asylum seekers who may end up there could be at risk?
Well, it's very interesting, or depending on the perspective, terrifying to note that up to the election campaign, where the Danish Social Democrats actually first voiced this proposal, there was a requirement that a host country had to be democratic. But quite vocally, about a month and a half ago, the government went out and dropped that condition, saying the institutions do not have to be democratic. Also, we have to add an important qualification here, which is no agreement has been made with any of the countries mentioned, not even Rwanda. It is true that two Danish ministers traveled to Rwanda to conduct a memorandum of understanding, but the Minister of Immigration in Denmark has been forced in Parliament to say that actually that memorandum does not include anything like this proposal. And also, there's no actual negotiations about this proposal. So what we're actually seeing is a legislation that's now passed that has no real substance. All of the human rights guarantees and the protection guarantees that the government is assuming will be possible, it cannot actually point to any concrete institution or country responsible for this, because no country has agreed to the Danish legislation.
So no country has agreed yet. And I wonder what benefit it may be to those countries. What is it that Denmark is offering them in order to potentially take in these asylum seekers?
That's right. It's not yet. And I think that's a crucial point, actually, also in wider European asylum policy these years, because what it does is it places a country like Rwanda in a very advantageous negotiation position. And what they did get out of this memorandum of understanding was agricultural benefits, a new deal on development aid, and also a Danish guarantee on the export of biometric surveillance technology to the Rwandan asylum system. So what it actually creates, this kind of externalization push, is some pretty clear incentives among certain countries not to go into it, not to agree to it, but to place themselves in a position where they might agree to it, and then ask in return from the Danish government, in this case, for a rising number of benefits, political legitimacy, economic trade, and so on. Let's not forget that in the case of Rwanda, Paul Kagame's regime won the last so-called democratic election with 99% of the vote, which is certainly a different form of democracy. When this regime is being seen as talking and negotiating with a country like Denmark, there's obvious political benefits in this. So that's a repercussion of the quite transparent Danish desire to avoid asylum seekers on Danish territory.
Yeah, and just briefly, if you could, finally, how do Danes feel about this plan?
Well, that's a good question. There has been a lot of critique from civil society organizations and actors and international organizations as well. If we rewind to when the current government came into power, quite unlike Danish elections, that election was not one primarily about immigration. It was actually one about climate change. So in that election campaign and what got them the votes to be in government, there was no mention actually of this proposal. And in the collaborative agreement between the center-left parties, the left parties are all opposed to this, by the way, there was no mention of this either. So if we judge it by the token of the vote that got them into government, this is not something that had a wide support. But obviously, the Social Democrats have conducted a quite multifaceted media campaign ever since. So, of course, there is also in Parliament, a lot of the right-wing parties are quite positive. But they've also been placed in a different kind of situation because this proposal is more radical than any of the proposals that the Danish right-wing has proposed in last decade. So in a way, the Social Democratic government has passed them, the right-wing, right around with this proposal.